The locksmith's drill bit hit metal at exactly 2:17 p.m., and the sound was louder than I expected. A violent, grinding shriek that echoed through my hallway and out onto the quiet suburban street. My mother was still standing on the porch when it started, one manicured hand pressed dramatically against her chest like she was the one being violated. My father stood beside her, jaw tight, arms crossed, as if this were some childish tantrum I'd snap out of any second. The deadbolt gave way with a dull metallic pop, and when it dropped into the locksmith's palm, something inside my chest loosened for the first time in 29 years. "You're making a mistake," my father called through the open doorway. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried the same quiet authority that had ruled my childhood. The locksmith hesitated, glancing at me. "Do you want me to continue, ma'am?" "Ma'am, not daughter, not child, not ungrateful girl." I swallowed and nodded. "Change all of them." My mother actually laughed at that. A short, incredulous sound. "All of them?" "Don't be ridiculous. We have a key." That was the problem. They did have a key. They had always had a key. Growing up, locks were treated like insults. When I was 13, I tried locking my bedroom door after my mom started reading my diary, out loud during arguments. My father removed the lock the next day. "Privacy is how families fall apart," he told me while unscrewing the knob. "We don't build walls in this house." What he meant was that walls only belonged to them. By 16, my phone was checked nightly. By 18, my bank account was monitored for my own good. When I moved into my first apartment after college, my mother cried until I handed over a spare key. "It's symbolic," she insisted. "We should always have access to each other." Access. Such a gentle word for something so absolute. The first time I came home and found my kitchen rearranged, she said she was helping. The second time, my dad had let himself in to check the water heater. The third time, they were sitting on my couch eating takeout I hadn't ordered. Surprised that I looked startled. "Why are you acting like we broke in?" my mother asked. "We're your parents." And somehow that sentence always ended the conversation. Until the day it didn't. Buying this house was supposed to be different. I didn't tell them I was house hunting until the papers were signed. I paid the down payment alone. I chose the neighborhood alone. When I held those keys at closing, they felt heavier than metal should feel. They felt like proof. But the moment my parents stepped through the front door for the first time, my mother's eyes went straight to the lock. "We'll need a copy," she said lightly, already scanning the entryway like she owned it. I should have said no then. Instead, I heard myself say, "Of course." And that single word followed me all the way to 2:17 p.m., when the locksmith's drill screamed through the illusion that this house still belonged to anyone but me. At 2:26 p.m., the front lock was replaced, the back door rekeyed, and the garage keypad reset to numbers my parents would never guess. I stood just inside the threshold while the locksmith packed his tools, the sharp scent of metal and sawdust hanging in the air like evidence. My mother had stopped pretending this was amusing. Her arms were folded tightly now, her purse clutched under one elbow, as if I might confiscate that too. "You're overreacting," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "After everything we've done for you, this is how you treat us?" There it was, the invoice they'd been handing me my entire life. Everything came with a receipt. Piano lessons, braces, college advice I never asked for. Love in our family was transactional. My father stepped forward, lowering his voice the way he used to when I was a child, and he wanted compliance without a scene. "Give us the new key," he said calmly. Not asked, said. The locksmith glanced between us again. I could feel his discomfort, but I could also feel something else rising in me, something steadier than guilt. "No," I replied. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. My mother's eyes widened like I'd cursed at her. "Excuse me?" "You don't need a key anymore," I said. "If you want to come over, you can call first." The silence that followed was suffocating. For a second, I thought my father might actually laugh, dismiss this as a joke the way he always had when I tried to set boundaries before. Instead, his face hardened in a way that made me feel 12 again, standing in the kitchen while he explained why my feelings were disrespectful. "We will not schedule appointments to see our own daughter," he said. "This isn't a doctor's office." "It's my house," I answered. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, but I forced myself to hold his gaze. "And I'm not a child," my mother scoffed. "You're acting like we've done something wrong." We were just
एक
making
मिनट
sure
आया.
everything was okay. Everything was always just making sure, just checking, just helping, just stopping by. I thought about the afternoon, 2 weeks earlier, when I'd come home from work, early with a migraine, and found their car in my driveway. They hadn't told me they were coming. They'd let themselves in, of course. I'd walked into my bedroom and found my mother kneeling beside my nightstand, holding a stack of papers, my medical records. "I was worried," she'd said quickly. "You never tell me anything anymore." My father had been in my office, scrolling through my laptop. "Your password is still your childhood dog," he'd remarked without looking up. I remember standing there, dizzy from more than just the migraine, realizing they didn't see this as intrusion. They saw it as entitlement. When I confronted them later that night, my father's voice had gone cold. "As long as we have a key, we have a right to ensure our daughter isn't making mistakes." That sentence echoed in my mind now as the locksmith handed me the final set of keys. "Ensure our daughter isn't making mistakes." As if my life were a test they were supervising. My mother's tone shifted suddenly, turning syrupy. "Sweetheart," she said, stepping closer to the door. "You're embarrassed right now. That's all. Give us a copy tomorrow after you calm down." She reached toward me like she expected me to fold the way I always had before, but the weight of the new keys in my hand felt different, solid, final. "There won't be a copy," I said quietly. And for the first time, I watched the certainty on their faces begin to crack. The crack in their certainty didn't shatter all at once. It spread slowly, like a fracture through glass you only notice when the light hits it just right. My father recovered first.
एक
He
मिनट
always did.
आया.
His expression smoothed into something almost pitying, like I was embarrassing myself in public. "You're letting independence go to your head," he said evenly. "This isn't how family behaves." I almost laughed at that. Family. The word had always meant obedience in our house. Agreement. Alignment. When I was 8, I wanted to quit ballet because I hated performing on stage. My mother told me, "You don't quit things that reflect on the family." When I was 17 and got accepted to a college out of state, my father said, "Why would you leave the people who protect you?" Protection had always come with surveillance. Love came with oversight. Even my career choice had been gently redirected towards something stable they could explain proudly at dinner parties. And for years, I convinced myself that was normal. Standing in my doorway now, keys pressing into my palm, I realized something uncomfortable. They weren't shocked because I'd changed the locks. They were shocked because I'd acted without asking. My mother's eyes flicked past me into the house,
एक
scanning the
मिनट
entryway
आया.
like she was memorizing it. "We've always had access," she said softly, as if reminding me of a tradition. "Since your first apartment, you said it made you feel safer." That part was true. I had said that. I'd been 24, alone in a new city, still half-trained to believe I couldn't function without them. But safety that requires surrender isn't safety at all. It's dependency. "I don't need that anymore," I said. The words felt foreign but steady. My father's jaw tightened again. "This is about that little disagreement last week, isn't it?" Little disagreement. That's what he called walking into my house unannounced and bringing a contractor with him. I'd come home from work to find a stranger measuring my living room walls. My mother was standing beside him, gesturing toward the ceiling. "If you ever decide to renovate," she was saying, "we think removing this wall would improve resale value." Resale value. I hadn't even finished unpacking, and they were discussing my exit strategy. "We're thinking long term," my dad had explained when I demanded to know why there was a man with a tape measure in my house. "You don't always make practical decisions." That had been the moment something inside me shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to recognize that they didn't see my home as mine. It was an extension of them, a satellite property under parental jurisdiction.
एक
"You
मिनट
brought a
आया.
stranger into my house," I said now, my voice sharper than I intended, "without telling me." "He wasn't a stranger," my mother snapped. "He was a professional." "He was a man I didn't invite," I replied. The air between us felt charged, like the seconds before a summer storm breaks. My father stepped closer to the threshold, testing it, as if daring me to stop him. "Move," he said quietly, not angrily, not loudly, just confidently. It was the same tone he used when I was a child blocking the television during one of his shows. And for a split second, my body reacted the old way. muscles tensing, instinct urging compliance. But I didn't move. I stayed exactly where I was, one hand still wrapped around the new keys, the other braced against the door. No, I said. The word landed heavier this time. Not defensive, not emotional, just final. And that was when my mother's composure finally slipped, her voice rising in a way that drew the attention of a neighbor across the street. You cannot lock us out of your life, she said sharply. I met her eyes and answered, I'm not locking you out of my life. I'm locking you out of my house. For a moment, none of us spoke. The distinction hung in the air between us, sharp and undeniable. Not my life, my house. To anyone else, it might have sounded reasonable. To my parents, it was betrayal dressed up as independence. My mother's face flushed, the color rising from her collarbone to her cheeks. There is no difference, she insisted. Your home is part of your life. We are part of your life. Therefore you don't automatically get a key. I interrupted, surprising even myself. I had never cut her off mid-sentence before. My father noticed. His eyes narrowed slightly, recalibrating. This wasn't the daughter who avoided conflict by apologizing first. This wasn't the girl who softened her tone to keep the peace. You're being influenced, he said carefully. Is this about someone else? Is there something you're not telling us? There it was again. The assumption that any boundary must have an outside cause. A boyfriend, a therapist, a friend filling my head with radical ideas about privacy. It couldn't possibly be my own decision. No one is influencing me, I said. I just don't want people entering my home without my permission. My mother let out a disbelieving laugh. People? We are not people. We are your parents. The way she said it made the word parents sound like a legal override, a master password that unlocked every door. And for most of my life, it had been. When I was 26, I tried changing my phone password after my mother scrolled through my messages while I was in the shower during a visit home. She cried for 2 hours, said I was shutting her out, said secrets destroy families. I changed it back that same night. When I refinanced my student loans without consulting my father, he didn't speak to me for a week. Major financial decisions should involve us, he'd said afterward, as if my signature alone wasn't enough. Every step toward autonomy had been treated like rebellion. And now here we were, standing on opposite sides of a door that finally worked the way doors are supposed to. My father exhaled slowly, as if trying one last strategy. We worry about you, he said, softer now. The world isn't safe. If something happens and we can't get in, then I'll call you, I replied. Like an adult. The word adult seemed to irritate him more than anything else. I'd said. My mother's gaze drifted past me again, lingering on the hallway, the staircase, the framed art I'd chosen without her input. I realized what she was really mourning wasn't access. It was authority. So that's it? She asked quietly. We're outsiders now? The question almost pulled me back into old patterns. The urge to reassure her, to smooth this over, to say of course not, and hand over a key just to restore balance. But balance had always meant me bending. You're my parents, I said carefully. But this is my home. If you want to come over, you call. If I say it's not a good time, you respect that. My father shook his head slowly, disappointment radiating off him like heat. You're drawing lines that don't need to exist. They've always existed, I said. I just never enforced them. That seemed to land, not dramatically, but enough to register. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line, the same expression she wore when I disappointed her as a child. Only this time I didn't feel small under it. I felt steady. My father reached for the old key in his pocket and held it up between his fingers. So this is useless now? He asked. I nodded. He stared at it for a long second, then at me, as if waiting for me to flinch. When I didn't, he let the key drop onto the porch between us. The metal hit the concrete with a faint, hollow clink. It was such a small sound, but it echoed louder than the drill had. They didn't storm off. They didn't yell or make a dramatic scene. They simply turned around and walked back to their car with a heavy, synchronized silence that felt more punishing than any shouting match. I stood in the doorway watching them. My mother didn't look back. Her shoulders hunched as if she were carrying the weight of my perceived betrayal. My father walked with a stiff, purposeful gait, his eyes fixed on the driveway. When their car finally pulled away, the sound of the engine felt unnervingly loud in the quiet afternoon. I stood there for a long time, the new keys still gripped tightly in my hand, waiting for the wave of triumph to hit me. I expected to feel like a conqueror, like a woman who had finally won her freedom. But instead, there was only a hollow, gnawing ache in my stomach. The silence that rushed into the house as I closed the door wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. It felt like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for the impact of what I had just done. I walked into the living room and sat on the edge of the sofa. The same sofa they had been sitting on just minutes before. The space felt different now, emptier, yet somehow more crowded with the ghosts of all the times I had yielded. I looked at the old key sitting on the porch through the window, a small, jagged piece of metal that represented 30 years of being watched, checked and managed. I went to the door, picked it up, and threw it into the junk drawer in the kitchen, burying it under old batteries and menus. I wanted it out of sight. I wanted it out of my mind. But my phone had other plans. It started vibrating against the coffee table almost immediately. A text from my mother. "We are heartbroken. We never thought you could be so cold to the people who gave you everything." Then a call from my father, which I didn't answer. Then another text. "Your father is sitting in silence. He can't believe this is the woman we raised." I stared at the screen, my heart racing. This was the script. This was the choreography of their disappointment. They weren't angry because I had broken a rule. They were angry because the rules no longer applied to them. But as I scrolled through the messages, a realization began to settle over me, colder and sharper than the guilt. This wouldn't stop with them. In our family, a boundary isn't just a personal choice. It's a threat to the entire ecosystem. They wouldn't just sit in their silence. They would call the aunts, the uncles, the cousins. They would spin a tale of a daughter lost to pride and arrogance. They would turn my independence into a tragedy that required a family intervention. The locksmith had changed my locks, but he couldn't change the fact that I was still part of a tribe that viewed privacy as a sin. The storm wasn't passing. It was just gathering. Strength, the first call came. From my Aunt Marlene at 6:42 p.m. I knew it would be her before. I even looked at the screen. She was my mother's older sister and the unofficial spokesperson for family emergencies, whether the emergency was medical or emotional. I let it ring twice before answering. "Hi, Aunt Marlene." I kept my voice neutral. There was a brief pause, the kind people use when they're deciding how gently to deliver a reprimand. "Sweetheart," she began. Her tone dipped in syrupy concern. "Your mother is very upset." Of course she was. In our family, emotions traveled fast and facts traveled slow. "I'm aware," I said quietly. Another pause. "She said you changed the locks on your house. On them." The phrasing was deliberate. Not on the house, on them. Like I'd weaponized a door. "I changed the locks on my house," I corrected gently. "That's all, Aunt." Marlene sighed the way adults do when a child insists the sky is green. "Honey, parents don't deserve to be shut out. They worry. That's what parents do." I stared at the hallway where the new deadbolt gleamed under the light. "Worry doesn't require a key," I replied. That wasn't the answer she wanted. Within the hour, 2 cousins texted me variations of the same message. "We heard what happened. Are you okay? This doesn't sound like you." One of them added, "Your mom said you've been distant lately." Distant, another carefully chosen word. In our family, distance meant disobedience. It meant stepping out of orbit. I didn't respond to any of them. By 8 p.m., my phone felt radioactive in my hand. Notifications stacked up like accusations. My father left a voicemail at 8:13. I listened to it once. His voice was calm, almost weary. "We don't understand why you're escalating this. No one was trying to hurt you. We've always had access because we've always needed to protect you. If you think this is adulthood, you're mistaken." I replayed that last line. If you think this is adulthood. The implication was clear. Adulthood, in their definition, was conditional. It was granted, not claimed. I set the phone down and walked through my house slowly, touching the back of a chair, the edge of the kitchen counter, the frame of a doorway. Everything was exactly where I had left it. No cabinets shifted, no drawers opened. No subtle rearranging that let me know someone had been there. The quiet wasn't heavy anymore. It was honest. At 9:02 p.m., my mother finally sent the message I knew was coming. "If something happens to you and we can't get in, remember that this was your choice." There it was. The curse disguised as concern. I stared at the words for a long time. For years, fear had been their strongest currency. Fear of danger, fear of mistakes, fear of being alone. But standing in my living room, under my own roof, I felt something unfamiliar pushing back against that fear, trust, not in them, in myself. They believed access equaled love, that control equaled care, but love shouldn't require surveillance. It shouldn't require spare keys hidden in parental pockets. As the night deepened and the calls finally slowed, I realized something important. The real test wasn't changing the locks. It was enduring the backlash, because in my family, boundaries weren't just inconvenient. They were revolutionary, and revolutions always come with consequences. By the next morning, the silence had shifted again. The flood of calls had stopped, replaced with something more calculated. I woke up to a group text I hadn't been part of since my cousin's wedding 3 years ago. The title had been changed to Family. Check-in, my mother had added. Me back in at 6:11 a.m. The first message was from her. We believe in open communication. Since there seems to be confusion, we want to resolve this as a family. Confusion. I read the word twice. There had been nothing confusing about me saying no. The replies began stacking underneath. My uncle, proud of you both for trying to fix this peacefully. My cousin, families shouldn't let small misunderstandings grow. Small misunderstandings. It was almost impressive how quickly the narrative had been polished. The contractor in my living room had become a misunderstanding. Years of unannounced entries had become care. My boundary had become drama. Then my father typed. I watched the little typing bubble appear and disappear 3 times before the message finally landed. We have always had access to our daughter's home for safety reasons. Yesterday, she made a public show of revoking that access without discussion. We are asking for a conversation and basic respect. Public show. I felt heat rise up my neck. There had been no audience except a locksmith and possibly Mrs. Dwyer across the street watering her plants. But in my father's version, I had staged a spectacle. Respect in his vocabulary had always meant agreement. I put my phone down and made coffee, forcing myself not to respond immediately. Reacting quickly was what they expected. Emotional, defensive, apologetic. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table and let the messages continue without me. At 7:02 a.m., my mother sent a photo. It was of the old key lying on their kitchen counter at home. This didn't deserve to be thrown away, she wrote. That stopped me. I hadn't thrown it away. I'd put it in my junk drawer. But the symbolism was clear. They had kept their copy. The implications settled in slowly and coldly. If they still had a key, then yesterday hadn't been the first time they'd used it without telling me. My stomach tightened. How many times had I come home to subtle differences and dismissed them as imagination? How many times had something felt slightly off and I'd convinced myself I was being paranoid? A memory surfaced uninvited. 3 months ago, coming home from work and finding my bedroom window unlocked. I had blamed myself. Another time, noticing my laptop slightly angled differently on my desk. I had shrugged it off. Now staring at the photo of that key, I felt something sharper than guilt. I felt exposed. The group chat continued to buzz. Aunt Marlene, let's not let pride ruin decades of love. My cousin, maybe everyone just needs to cool down. As if this were a shared argument instead of a pattern I'd finally interrupted. At 7:19 a.m., my father sent one final message. We will come by this evening to discuss this properly. Not can we? Not would you be available? Will? I stared at the sentence, reading it again and again. He wasn't asking for access anymore. He was assuming presence. And for the first time, instead of feeling 12 years old and cornered, I felt something else entirely, prepared. I didn't respond to the group chat. I didn't argue, defend, or explain. I simply muted it and set my phone face down on the counter. If my father planned to come by this evening, then he was going to learn something important. About doors. All day at work, I felt a strange clarity settle over me. Not anger, not panic, just focus. For years, every confrontation with my parents had caught me emotionally off guard because I'd never allowed myself to prepare for one. I always assumed things would smooth over, that I would smooth them over. But this time, they had announced their move in advance. That changed the rules. I left work early and stopped by a hardware store before heading home. Not because the locks weren't secure, they were, but because control, I was realizing, wasn't just about physical access. It was about assumption. I bought a small no-soliciting plaque and, after a moment's hesitation, a simple doorbell camera to install above the frame. Not dramatic, not aggressive, just visible. When I pulled into my driveway at 5:12 p.m., their car wasn't there yet. Good. I installed the camera carefully, following the instructions twice, making sure the angle captured the entire porch. Then I screwed the plaque beside the doorbell. The message was neutral, polite, clear. I stepped back and looked at my front door. It looked the same as it had yesterday, but it felt different, intentional. At 6:03 p.m., my phone buzzed, a notification from the camera app. Motion detected. My heart didn't race. It steadied. I opened the feed. My parents were walking up the driveway together, my father slightly ahead, my mother carrying that same structured handbag like armor. He didn't knock immediately. He tried the handle first. The new lock held firm. I watched his shoulders stiffen when it didn't turn. Then he pressed the doorbell. Inside the house, the chime echoed calmly. I didn't move right away. I let him ring it a second time. On the third press, I walked to the door but didn't open it. Instead, I spoke through the camera speaker, my voice clearer than I expected. Did you call before coming? There was a pause on the porch. My father leaned closer to the camera, squinting slightly. Open the door, he said. The old command, flat, confident. I kept my tone even. Did you call? My mother stepped into view. We told you this morning we were coming, she said tightly. That's not the same as asking. Silence stretched between us, filtered through glass and technology and 30 years of hierarchy. A neighbor's dog barked in the distance. My father glanced at the small plaque beside the bell, then back at the camera lens. I could see the calculation in his expression. He hadn't expected resistance at the threshold. This is absurd, he muttered. We are not strangers. Then you can act like family, I replied. Family calls first. My hand rested lightly against the inside of the door, but I didn't unlock it. For once, the barrier wasn't just wood and steel. It was choice. And for the first time in my life, I was the one deciding who crossed it. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. My father wasn't used to negotiating through barriers. He was used to walking into rooms and having space made for him automatically. The porch light flicked on above their heads as the evening deepened, casting sharp shadows across his face. We are not doing this through a speaker, he said finally, his voice clipped. Open the door so we can speak properly. Properly. As if proximity guaranteed fairness, as if being physically inside my home restored the balance he preferred. We can talk right there, or you can call and schedule a time. My mother let out a short, incredulous laugh. Schedule a time? With our own daughter? She stepped closer to the camera, her expression tight. Do you hear yourself? I did hear myself, and that was the difference. Before my voice would have shaken, I would have rushed to soften it. Now it sounded steady, measured. Yes, I said simply. My father tried the handle again, not aggressively, just reflexively. When it didn't budge, his jaw flexed. That small movement told me more than any raised voice could have. He wasn't shocked by the boundary anymore. He was irritated that it was holding. You're embarrassing us, he said quietly. The neighbors can see this. Glanced at the live feed, thumbnail showing the wider angle. Mrs. Dwyer's curtains had shifted slightly. Across the street, he was right. Someone was probably watching. The old version of me would have folded instantly at that. Public discomfort was my father's favorite leverage. But something had shifted. I'm standing inside my house, I replied. You're the ones on the porch. My mother's composure cracked first. After everything we've sacrificed, she snapped, her voice rising. After raising you, paying for you, worrying about you every single day, this is how you repay us. There it was again. The ledger, the invisible debt. I felt the familiar pull of guilt try to rise in my chest, but I didn't let it take over. You chose to raise me, I said quietly. That wasn't a loan. The words seemed to stun them more than the locked door had. My father's eyes hardened. You think you're proving something right now, he said. You think this makes you strong. He leaned slightly toward the camera. It makes you alone, that landed. Not because it was true, but because it was the fear they had planted in me for decades. That independence meant isolation, that boundaries meant exile. For a split second, I imagined opening the door just to make that threat disappear. But then I looked past them into the darkening street, at the house behind them, at the quiet world that didn't collapse just because I said no. If being alone means being respected, I answered, then I'll be okay. My mother looked at my father, searching his face for the next move. For once, he didn't have one ready. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Finally, he straightened his jacket, stepping back from the camera's frame. "This isn't finished," he said. Not a shout, not a plea, a promise. And then, without another word, they turned and walked down the driveway again. I stayed at the door until their car disappeared at the end of the street. Only then did I allow myself to exhale fully. The locks had held, but I had a feeling the real test wasn't over, not even close. The next move didn't come that night. It came 3 days later, folded neatly into a certified envelope waiting in my mailbox. I knew it was from them before I even saw the return address. My father believed in documentation when emotion failed. Paper trails, official tone. I stood at my kitchen counter and slid it open carefully, half expecting something dramatic, some legal threat, some claim over the house. Instead, it was a letter, typed, signed by both of them. The first paragraph was measured, almost corporate. "We are concerned about your recent behavior and the influence external factors may be having on your decision-making." External factors, as if autonomy were contagious. The second paragraph shifted tone. They felt deeply hurt and publicly humiliated. The third paragraph made the real point clear. If you intend to maintain a relationship with this family, certain mutual understandings must be restored. Mutual. I actually sat down when I read that word, because for the first time, I saw it plainly. Access had never been mutual. They had keys to my spaces, passwords to my accounts, opinions on every major decision. I had none of the same privileges in their world. I had never walked into their bedroom unannounced, never opened their mail, never demanded oversight of their finances. Their version of mutual meant symmetrical authority tilted in their favor. At the bottom of the letter was a final line written in my father's handwriting instead of typed text. "We will not beg for entry into our daughter's life." I read that sentence 3 times. Not beg, entry into my life. They still believed the door in question led to something they owned. That was when the last thread of guilt finally snapped. I didn't draft a long reply. I didn't defend myself point by point. I wrote 1 page, by hand. "I'm not asking you to beg," I began. "I am asking you to respect boundaries." I explained calmly and clearly that a relationship built on access instead of trust wasn't a relationship. I could continue. That visits required consent. That privacy wasn't punishment. That love without control was still love. At the bottom, I added 1 final sentence. "The door is closed to entitlement, not to you." I mailed it the next morning. Weeks passed. The group chat stayed silent. No surprise visits, no drive-by inspections. For the first time since I bought the house, nothing felt slightly disturbed when I came home. No subtle shifts. No second-guessing my memory. Just stillness. One Sunday afternoon, my phone rang. My mother's name lit up the screen. I let it ring once before answering. Her voice was different, quieter. "Can we come by next Saturday?" she asked. Not "we're coming." Not "we need to talk." "Can we?" The words settled gently into the space between us. I took a slow breath. "Yes," I said. At 2, when I hung up, I walked to the front door and looked at the lock. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a wall. It was a boundary, solid, neutral. Mine, they, had said they would always have access to my home. For most of my life, I believed that was love. But love that ignores permission isn't love, it's possession. The locksmith hadn't just changed. My locks that afternoon at 2:17, he had changed the terms, and for the first time, access to me wasn't automatic. It was intentional.